Somewhere beneath 7 meters of reinforced concrete, 80 of the most advanced submarines ever built by Nazi Germany sit in total darkness. They have been there since 1945. They will be there forever, not because no one tried to destroy them. They tried, repeatedly, desperately, with everything they had. And the concrete laughed. This is the story of the Valentin submarine pens in Bremen, Germany, the largest bunker ever built on German soil. A structure so massive, so indestructible, and so haunted by the 1,600 forced labourers who died building it that the German government spent decades debating what to do with it. It is a place where engineering genius and industrial evil existed inside the same walls, sometimes within the same breath. And when you understand what was being built inside it and why and at what cost in human life, you will never look at a concrete wall the same way again. To understand why this bunker exists, you have to go back to 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic was not going well for the Allies. That is an understatement of almost criminal proportion. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U-boats destroyed over 500 Allied ships, more than 3 million tons of supplies. Food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, soldiers, all of it dragged to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, the submarines. But here is what nobody expected. Even as the Allies began turning the tide against conventional U-boats in 1943, the Germans were already building something that would make everything that came before it obsolete, something that would change submarine warfare permanently, something that, had it arrived 6 months earlier, might genuinely have changed the outcome of the war. The Type 21 U-boat was not an improvement on existing submarines, it was a revolution. Every submarine operating in the Second World War shared the same fundamental limitation. They were not true submarines at all. They were surface ships that could dive. They spent most of their operational time on the surface, charging their batteries, breathing air, vulnerable to aircraft and destroyers. They dove only when threatened. Underwater, they were slow, clumsy, nearly blind, and severely limited in how long they could stay submerged. The typical Type 7 U-boat could stay underwater for roughly 24 hours before it had to surface and run its diesel engines. And when it surfaced, every Allied radar station, every patrolling aircraft, every destroyer escort in the area suddenly had a target. The Type 21 changed everything. It was designed from the keel up to be a true underwater vessel. It carried 3 times the battery capacity of any previous U-boat. It could stay submerged for 3 full days without surfacing. Its snorkel system allowed it to run its diesels just below the surface, making it nearly impossible to detect by radar. Underwater, it could sustain a speed of 17 knots, faster than most Allied escort vessels could travel on the surface. It carried an acoustic homing torpedo system that could fire 6 torpedoes in under 20 seconds without the crew even needing to look through a periscope. It was, by every meaningful measure, a weapon from the future dropped into a war being fought in the past. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, understood immediately what the Type 21 could do. He grasped something even more important. Building it through conventional methods, one at a time in traditional shipyards, would take far too long. The Allies were bombing German shipyards relentlessly. Hamburg, Kiel, Bremen, all of them were under constant attack from the RAF and the USAAF. A submarine sitting on a slipway was a submarine that could be destroyed before it ever touched water. Speer needed a way to build these submarines faster, safer, and in volumes that would overwhelm Allied anti-submarine forces before they could adapt. He reached for a concept that the German construction industry had never attempted at this scale: prefabrication. The Type 21 would not be built as a single unit in a single location. It would be assembled from 8 pre-built sections, each section manufactured at a different inland factory far from Allied bombing routes, then transported by canal and river barge to a central assembly point. In theory, a complete submarine could be assembled in under 6 days. Compared to the months required by conventional construction, this was staggering. Speer promised Hitler 40 new Type 21 U-boats per month. By comparison, Germany had never produced more than 30 submarines of any type in any single month of the war. But here was the problem that made everything else secondary. Where do you assemble them? You cannot do it in the open. Allied bombers owned the skies over northern Germany by 1943. A facility large enough to assemble submarines in sections would be visible from 30,000 feet and would draw raids within days of opening. You need a roof, not just any roof, a roof that no bomb then in existence could penetrate. And you need it built before the Allies realize what you're building underneath it. This was the requirement handed to the organization Todt, the Nazi construction agency responsible for building military infrastructure across occupied Europe. The engineers looked at maps of the German coastline and found their answer on the west bank of the Weser River, 6 miles north of Bremen's city centre, near a small town called Farge. The site had several advantages that bordered on perfect. It sat beside a deep-water river channel that could accommodate ocean-going vessels. It was close enough to Bremen's industrial infrastructure to receive materials efficiently. It was far enough from obvious military targets that Allied planners might not immediately recognize its significance. Construction began in June 1943, and what they built there over the next 20 months still defies comfortable description. The Valentin submarine pens, named for the patron saint of the nearby church, measured 426 meters long and 97 meters wide. That is longer than 4 American football fields placed end to end, and nearly as wide as one of them is long. The internal volume of the structure exceeded 35 million cubic feet. To give that number meaning, you could fit the Empire State Building inside it with room to spare. The roof was 7 meters thick, reinforced concrete poured in continuous sections to prevent any seam or joint that a bomb might exploit. The walls at their base measured 11 meters thick. The whole structure consumed over 1 million cubic meters of concrete. Workers poured concrete 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in shifts that never stopped, regardless of weather, temperature, or the physical condition of the men doing the work. Those men. This is where the story turns in a direction from which it never fully returns. The organization Todt did not build the Valentin pens with paid volunteers. It built them with slaves, from concentration camps, from prisoner of war camps, from the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. An estimated 10,000 forced laborers worked on this structure over its construction period. They lived in conditions that the post-war tribunal at Nuremberg would later describe with clinical language that failed to capture the reality. They worked 12-hour shifts in cold, wet, concrete-filled air. They moved steel reinforcing bars that weighed more than they did. They were fed starvation rations calculated to extract maximum labor before death made replacement necessary. When workers became too weak to continue, they were removed and replaced. Where they went after removal was not a question the organization Todt encouraged anyone to ask. The official death toll recorded during construction was 1,600 people. Historians who have studied the site believe the true number was higher. Some estimates reach 4,000. The deaths came from overwork, from exposure, from accidents involving heavy machinery and falling concrete, and from deliberate violence by guards who treated their authority as license. Among the workers were French civilians transported from occupied France, Soviet prisoners of war for whom the Geneva Convention was considered irrelevant by German authorities, political prisoners, and Jews transported from camps across the Reich. They built a monument to German engineering while being worked toward their own deaths. The concrete they poured contains, in every meaningful moral sense, their remains. By early 1945, the structure was approximately 90% complete. The internal assembly line was being fitted with its equipment. The overhead crane system, designed to lift complete submarine sections weighing hundreds of tons, was being installed. The first Type 21 sections began arriving by barge in early 1945, and the engineers were confident that full-scale production would begin within weeks. At peak capacity, the Valentin pens were designed to assemble one complete submarine every 56 hours. That is roughly 13 new Type 21 U-boats every month from this facility alone. Then, on March 27, 1945, the Royal Air Force arrived. not with conventional bombs, with something new. The Tallboy bomb was the creation of Barnes Wallis, the same British engineer who designed the bouncing bomb used in the famous Dambusters raid of 1943. The Tallboy weighed 5,400 kilograms, nearly 6 tons, and was designed not to explode on impact like a conventional bomb, but to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, creating an underground shockwave that could destroy structures from below. Conventional bombs dropped on the Valentin pens by earlier raids had achieved nothing. They exploded against the concrete roof and left craters that the Germans filled within days. The concrete was simply too thick. RAF Bomber Command's Air Commodore understood that standard ordnance was useless here and requested tallboys specifically for this target. On that March morning, 617 Squadron, the same unit that had carried out the Dambusters raid, dropped tallboys on the Valentin pens in a precision attack. 2 bombs penetrated the roof. The results were dramatic, but given the scale of the structure, limited. A section of the roof collapsed. 2 of the overhead cranes were destroyed. Several partially assembled submarine sections were damaged beyond repair. But the bunker itself, the fundamental structure, survived. The assembly line was disrupted but not destroyed. German engineers estimated they could restore partial operations within weeks. It did not matter. By the time those weeks had passed, the Third Reich had ceased to exist. British forces entered Farge on April 27, 1945. The Valentin pens fell without a fight. The German workers and military personnel had fled. Inside, the British soldiers found something that took time to fully absorb. A construction site, frozen mid-motion, tools left where they had been dropped, partially assembled submarine sections sitting in the dry docks as though the workers had simply stepped away for lunch and never returned. The overhead rail system installed but never fully activated. Blueprints and engineering documents scattered across desks in offices that still had half-drunk coffee cups on them. And in the partially flooded lower sections they found evidence of the labour force that had built it. Clothing, personal items, the physical traces of thousands of human beings who had been worked here and then disappeared. The British military engineers who examined the facility submitted a report that ran to hundreds of pages. Their conclusion was stark. The Valentin pens represented the most sophisticated submarine assembly facility ever constructed. Had it become operational 6 months earlier, the naval balance in the Atlantic would have shifted in ways that no quantity of Allied escort vessels could have addressed in the short term. The Type 21 U-boat operating from this base would have been, in the engineers' carefully chosen words, a serious threat to Allied supply lines. Those words deserve to be read slowly. By early 1945, the war in Europe was clearly moving toward an Allied victory. But supply lines still mattered enormously. Operation Overlord's success depended on continuous resupply of the forces fighting in France and the Low Countries. Had a fleet of Type 21 submarines been operational in late 1944, attacking supply convoys with weapons and capabilities for which the Allies had no ready answer, the timeline of the war's conclusion in Europe could have extended by months. Months in which hundreds of thousands more people would have died. This is what the Valentin pens were built to produce. This is what the deaths of 1,600 forced labourers, or perhaps 4,000, were in service of. After the British takeover, the facility's fate became the subject of debate that dragged on for years. The new West German government, confronting the physical reality of this enormous structure sitting on the banks of the Weser, faced a problem that was both practical and deeply uncomfortable. The practical problem was simple enough. You cannot demolish it. Engineers assessed demolition options and concluded that destroying the Valentin pens through conventional means was effectively impossible. The structure would require so much explosive that the blast would damage the surrounding town of Farge and the infrastructure of the Weser riverbank. Alternative methods were similarly impractical. The concrete was too thick, too well poured, too deeply integrated with the ground beneath it to remove without creating a catastrophe. The bunker had been built, in a very real sense, to be indestructible. It had succeeded. The German Navy took over the facility in 1960 and used portions of it for storage and maintenance purposes for the next several decades. For much of the Cold War, the Valentin pens existed in a strange administrative limbo, simultaneously a piece of active naval infrastructure and an enormous monument to atrocity that no official would quite acknowledge as such. The forced labourers who had died building it were not commemorated. Their names were not recorded at the site. The bunker's history as a killing ground, dressed in the language of industrial necessity, was not taught in local schools. It simply sat there, massive and silent, beside the river. Then, in 1983, something happened that began to change everything. A group of local historians, many of them young people who had grown up in the shadow of this structure without being told what it was, began documenting the history of the forced labour program that had built it. They interviewed survivors, many of them elderly by then, who had been transported to Farge as young men from France, from Poland, from the Soviet Union. The testimonies they collected were published in a local historical journal with a circulation of a few hundred copies. But the story spread. Former workers, some of them living in France, read accounts of what had happened at Farge and recognized details of their own experience. Letters began arriving in Bremen from people who had survived and who had, for decades, assumed that no one in Germany knew or cared what had happened to them there. One of those letters came from a man named Jean-Pierre Renoir, a Frenchman who had been transported to Farge in 1944 as a forced labourer at the age of 19. He wrote that he had carried steel reinforcing bars in the wet concrete mud for 8 months, working alongside Soviet prisoners who were treated, in his words, as less than animals. He described watching men die of exhaustion and being told by guards to keep moving. He described the cold, the hunger, the total absence of any communication with his family in France. He described arriving at Farge and being told, in terms he understood immediately to be accurate, that his life was worth exactly as much as the labour he could provide, and no more. He survived because he was young and strong, and because a French-speaking German overseer occasionally ensured that the French workers received marginally better food than the Soviet prisoners. He had lived with that fact, the small, particular cruelty of differential survival, for 40 years before he wrote his letter to Bremen. The German Navy's use of the facility ended in the 1980s, and the structure was transferred to civilian administration. For a period, parts of the bunker were used by private businesses for storage. Portions of the vast interior became warehouse space. The idea of using a structure built by slave labour as commercial real estate disturbed many people and pleased no one, but the alternatives were limited by the fundamental impossibility of demolition. In 2011, the Valentin submarine pens were finally opened as a memorial and documentation centre. The process of creating it took years and generated substantial controversy. Some local politicians argued that the structure should simply be left as it was, a ruin, without interpretation or visitor facilities, on the grounds that providing amenities might seem to normalise or even celebrate what had occurred there. Others argued that silence was its own form of failure, that a structure this large and this historically significant, visited by thousands of people, whether officially opened or not, required context and explanation that only a proper memorial could provide. The memorial that opened represents a serious attempt to confront the full history of the site without sanitizing it. The 2 bomb craters created by the Tallboy bombs in March 1945 are preserved exactly as they were. The collapsed roof section where one of the bombs penetrated has not been repaired. Visitors walk through a space where the scale of both the engineering achievement and the human cost are simultaneously visible. The cranes are still partially in place. The dry docks are intact. And throughout the facility, the documentation centre presents the history of the forced labour programme with a directness that earlier German institutions sometimes struggled to achieve. The 80 Type 21 U-boats. Most of them were never completed. Of the Type 21s that were finished and commissioned across all German facilities, only 2 ever undertook operational war patrols. Neither fired a shot in combat. Both survived the war and were eventually surrendered to the Allies. The technology in those 2 submarines was studied intensively by British, American, and Soviet naval engineers. What they found in those hulls influenced submarine design for the next 30 years. The Soviet Navy's submarine program of the 1950s drew heavily on Type 21 technology. The American Navy's diesel-electric submarine designs of the post-war period incorporated principles first demonstrated by the Type 21. In a grim irony that defies simple moral categorization, the submarine that was never deployed in the war it was designed to win became one of the most influential weapons platforms of the Cold War that followed. The sections of Type 21 submarines that arrived at the Valentin pens in early 1945 and never made it into the water remain inside the structure to this day. They sit in the dry docks exactly where they were left when the workers fled in April 1945. Steel hulls, partially assembled, covered in the rust of 80 years but structurally intact in their basic form. They are perhaps the most haunting objects in a place full of haunting things. Weapons, systems that were almost history-changing, preserved in a concrete tomb built by the people they might have helped to kill. What the Valentin pens tell us, in their scale and their silence, is something about the nature of industrial ambition divorced from moral restraint. Speer's prefabrication concept was genuinely innovative. The Type 21 was a genuine technological leap. The engineering of the bunker itself represents a kind of terrible mastery. All of it was accomplished by treating human beings as raw material, as interchangeable components in a production system whose requirements were met by working people to death and replacing them. The concrete is indestructible. The names of most of those who poured it are lost. That asymmetry is the true legacy of the Valentin pens, not the submarines, not the engineering. The concrete remembers nothing of the hands that poured it. The hands are gone. Stand inside the Valentin pens today and the scale hits you before anything else. The ceiling is so high that rain clouds have been observed forming inside the structure in cold weather. The walls absorb sound in a way that is almost physical, giving the interior a silence that feels pressurized, as though the air itself has been compressed by the weight of the concrete surrounding it. The dry docks stretch away from you into semi-darkness. The rusted submarine sections sit in the middle distance like objects from a dream about a war that almost turned out differently. Barnes Wallis's two tall boy bomb craters are directly above you, penetrating the roof like punctuation marks at the end of a very long sentence. They are the only wounds this structure has ever received. They did not kill it. Nothing killed it. It will outlast every person alive today, and their children, and possibly their children's children. In 1943, Albert Speer told Hitler that the Valentin pens would produce enough Type 21 submarines to win the Battle of the Atlantic. He was probably right. The submarines never came. The facility was never finished. The war ended. And yet the bunker stands, 7 meters of concrete over the heads of the visitors who walk through it, impervious to bombs and time and the ordinary processes by which history is eventually buried. 80 submarines, entombed in concrete forever. 1,500 laborers, their names largely unknown, who built the tomb and died inside it. One structure that could not be destroyed, that would not go away, that finally had to be looked at directly and told the truth about. You cannot demolish it. You cannot ignore it. You can only walk through it and understand that some things, once built, cannot be unmade. The question the Valentin pens ask every person who enters them is the same question it has been asking since 1945. How did we let this happen? And the concrete offers no answer. It never will.